My family forbade me from being a doctor until I saved my. I was meant to be a doctor. That was never a question, not to me, at least. From the time I could read, I pored over my father's old anatomy textbooks, tracing the diagrams of the human circulatory system with my small fingers, whispering the Latin names like incantations. I spent hours pressing my ear to my own heartbeat, wondering at the engine inside me, so tireless, so precise. I imagined the thrill of holding life between my hands, of knowing that my choices, my knowledge, could tip the scales between existence and oblivion. And yet, when my sister Amaryllis and I stood side by side on the stage of Johns Hopkins, our hands gripping identical diplomas, our futures cracked apart like a fault line. The applause was still ringing in my ears when my parents pulled me aside, their faces drawn tight, the weight of their judgment heavy in the pit of my stomach. Calla, my mother, Marianne, said in a voice too even to be natural. You won't be practicing. I had laughed at first, thinking it was some cruel attempt at humor. But my father, Victor, did not laugh. He watched me with the same detached scrutiny he had reserved for childhood science projects, the ones I had worked on with obsessive perfectionism, only for him to sigh and point out every flaw. You don't have the instincts for it, he said. We've seen that for years. The world seemed to tilt beneath me. Amaryllis's hand tightened around mine, but she said nothing. She never had to fight to prove herself, our parents had always seen her brilliance as undeniable, while my own efforts were met with suspicion, every success examined under a microscope, every failure amplified. But I have my degree, I whispered, my voice thin. I passed all my exams. You barely scraped by, my mother interjected. Do you think we haven't spoken to your professors? They told us you struggle with decisiveness, with confidence. That's a danger in this field. We cannot, in good conscience, allow you to risk lives. My breath was shallow, my skin hot with shame. I had known I wasn't like Amaryllis, she possessed an effortless brilliance, a way of answering questions before they were even asked. But I had worked. I had pushed through the exhaustion, through the doubt, through the gnawing feeling that I was always trying to catch up. None of it mattered. Their decision was final. My medical career ended before it could even begin. They made arrangements. I was to return home to Atlanta and work for my uncle's medical supply company, safe behind a desk, as far from an operating room as they could keep me. And so, while Amaryllis moved to Boston for her residency at Massachusetts General, I found myself trapped in a glass office in Midtown, cataloging shipments of syringes and sutures, my hands idle, my mind restless. The days blurred together, sterile and meaningless. I became a ghost, haunting the edges of my own life, watching from a distance as Amaryllis thrived. She would call me between shifts, her voice crackling with exhaustion and exhilaration, recounting stories of complex surgeries, of lives saved, of the pressure, the rush, the triumph. I congratulated her, swallowing the bile that rose in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. Then, one evening, everything changed. I was walking home from work, cutting through a quiet side street, when I heard it, a wet, gasping breath, the kind that sends ice through your veins. My eyes darted toward the sound, and there, slumped against a dumpster, was a man, his shirt dark with blood. Panic clutched at my throat. I should have called 911. I should have run. Instead, I moved toward him, my body acting on instincts I hadn't even realized I had. Hey, I murmured, dropping to my knees beside him. Can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, pain-clouded. His lips moved, forming words I couldn't make out. I pressed my fingers to his neck, feeling for a pulse. It was thready, weak. The wound was a deep gash across his abdomen, the edges jagged. A knife wound. My mind split into two warring halves, the one that had spent years in training, absorbing every lesson on trauma response, and the one that heard my father's voice whispering, you don't have the instincts for it. But instincts weren't the point. This man was dying. I ripped off my scarf and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure, my hands steady in a way they had never been during exams, when the fear of failure had been my greatest enemy. Here, in the grimy alleyway, there was no professor watching, no grade to earn, just blood, slipping through my fingers, and a man's life weighing on my ability to act. I barely registered the sound of footsteps pounding toward me until a shadow loomed overhead. A woman, wide-eyed, breathless. Is he, she stammered, looking from me to the man. He needs an ambulance, I said, my voice sharp, certain. Now. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking as she dialed. The minutes stretched endlessly. I kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, watching for signs of worsening shock, for the moment his breath might rattle out of his chest, taking with it any chance of survival. Then, at last, the wail of sirens. Paramedics swarmed us, their efficiency both familiar and foreign. One of them, a man with graying hair and kind eyes, knelt beside me. You a doctor? He asked, assessing my work. I hesitated. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe that I still had the right to claim that title. But my degree sat useless in a frame, gathering dust in a life I wasn't allowed to live. No, I said finally. I'm not. He glanced at me, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded. Well, you saved his life. And in that moment, for the first time in years, I felt like a doctor again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment, staring at my hands, still stained faintly with blood, and felt something deep inside me crack open. I had spent so long believing my parents, believing that I wasn't capable, that I didn't belong in medicine. But they were wrong. I was meant to heal. And no one, not them, not the world, was going to stop me. Even if I had to find my own way back. I didn't tell anyone what had happened that night in the alley. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I knew, deep down, that no one in my family would care. No one would see it for what it was, proof that I had been right all along, that I was capable, that I had a place in medicine. Instead, they would twist it, diminish it, make it into another example of my recklessness, my supposed inability to think clearly under pressure. So I kept it to myself. I let it sit inside me like an ember, something small but burning, something waiting for the right moment to set everything else ablaze. But that didn't mean I wasn't unraveling. The days at my uncle's company grew more unbearable. I floated through meetings about latex glove inventory and bulk pricing on oxygen masks, my mind elsewhere, my hands itching to do something real. I spent my lunch breaks in the break room with medical journals spread out before me, pretending I still had a reason to stay sharp. No one at work noticed, or if they did, they didn't care. I was just Victor and Marianne's daughter, parked in a safe, easy job until I found something more suitable, meaning, of course, something far away from hospitals, patients, and anything that would let me call myself a doctor. Amaryllis, meanwhile, flourished. Every call from her was a reminder of the life I should have been living. She talked about her rotations, the long hours, the way the attending physicians trusted her to take charge, to make decisions. She spoke with confidence, the same effortless certainty she had always possessed, and I could hear in her voice the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. And worse, she didn't see the problem. I had always known my parents favored Amaryllis. It wasn't the kind of favoritism that was cruel or obvious, not the kind you could point to as proof of mistreatment. It was woven into the fabric of our family, a silent understanding that Amaryllis was the one who could be trusted, the one who would succeed, the one who would make them proud. I, on the other hand, was the one who needed watching, the one who needed guidance, the one who could be led astray by her own overreaching ambition. As children, it had been little things. Amaryllis was given the microscope for Christmas, while I received the beginner's chemistry set. She was the one our father quizzed at the dinner table, pushing her to explain complex biological processes, while I was asked how my other classes were going, as if my interest in medicine was an amusing side project rather than something real. In medical school, when Amaryllis had a hard week, they sent care packages, handwritten letters, calls of encouragement. When I struggled, they questioned whether I was cut out for it. When she excelled, they celebrated. When I did well, they asked if my professors had been generous in grading. But I had always assumed, naively, perhaps, that Amaryllis, at least, understood. That she saw what I saw, that she knew how unfair it was. I thought that even if she had been given the benefit of the doubt where I never had, she would at least acknowledge the imbalance. I was wrong. She came home for a rare visit in October, a weekend squeezed between rotations, and I had hoped, foolishly, that maybe, just maybe, I could talk to her, that she would see how lost I was, how much I needed her to be on my side. But within hours of her arrival, I knew exactly where she stood. Our parents adored having her home. They fawned over her, listening raptly as she spoke about the newest techniques she was learning, the complex cases she was handling. And then, inevitably, the conversation turned to me. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some small sign that Amaryllis understood. That she saw my exile from medicine for what it was. That she saw me. Instead, she reinforced everything they had ever said about me. She said she agreed with them. That she had seen me struggle, had watched me hesitate, second-guess myself in medical school. That she worried about what might happen if I were in a real emergency situation. That she understood why they had made their decision, and that I should, too. I sat in stunned silence as they nodded approvingly, as if she had spoken some deep and undeniable truth. It was like a final betrayal, the last confirmation that I had been utterly alone in this fight from the beginning. I left dinner early, my appetite gone, my head pounding. I spent the night in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, feeling something inside me calcify into something hard and immovable. For years, I had been trying to prove myself to them. I had fought for their approval, for their belief in me. I had let their voices dictate my sense of worth, let their doubts seep into my bones. But that night, I understood something I had never let myself admit before. They would never believe in me. Not really. Not in the way I needed them to. And I had wasted too much time waiting for permission to be the person I already knew I was. The next morning, I packed my bags and left before Amaryllis woke up. I drove back to my apartment in silence, my fingers clenched around the steering wheel. I didn't go to work that day. Instead, I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and started researching. If my family wasn't going to let me be a doctor the way they had planned, then I would find another way. It happened on a Sunday. A humid, suffocating August afternoon, the kind that made the air feel thick in Atlanta. I hadn't seen my parents or Amaryllis since I walked out of that dinner months ago, since I stopped waiting for them to believe in me. In that time, I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, seeking out opportunities that didn't require their approval. I had started volunteering at a free clinic on the south side of the city, one that operated in the legal gray areas of medicine, treating those who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't a hospital, and I wasn't an officially practicing physician, but I was healing people. I was doing what I was meant to do. And then, fate delivered a reckoning none of us could have predicted. I had just finished my shift at the clinic when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something in me knew before I even answered. My mother's voice came through the speaker, breathless, frantic, the edges of her words blurred by panic. My father had collapsed. It had happened at home, right there in the kitchen, his body crumpling like a marionette whose strings had been cut. Amaryllis had been with them, and she had called for an ambulance, but things had gone from bad to worse before help had arrived. His heart had stopped. By the time paramedics got him to the hospital, he was in critical condition. He had suffered a massive myocardial infarction, too much damage, too fast. The prognosis wasn't good. They were preparing for emergency surgery, but there were complications. And for the first time, my mother's voice, always sharp and full of certainty, cracked under the weight of desperation. I drove to the hospital without thinking. I shouldn't have. They didn't deserve my presence after all they had done, all the ways they had dismissed me. But it wasn't about them. It was about the man on that operating table, the man who had never believed in me, but whose heart had once beat in time with mine when I was a child, pressing my ear to his chest, listening to the steady, rhythmic proof that he was invincible. He wasn't invincible anymore. By the time I arrived, the waiting room was filled with an eerie kind of silence. Amaryllis was standing rigidly, arms crossed, her fingers digging into her skin like she could hold herself together by force. My mother was seated, hands clutched so tightly that her knuckles had gone pale. When they saw me, something shifted. Not anger, not resentment, something heavier, something closer to surrender. The surgery was taking too long. That was never a good sign. And then, something happened. A commotion beyond the doors. Raised voices, hurried movements. A nurse rushed through, calling for the surgeon on duty. My stomach dropped. I recognized that kind of urgency. Something had gone wrong. Instinct took over. I followed the nurse before anyone could stop me, past the swinging doors, into the chaos of the operating area. My presence should have meant nothing, an unlicensed doctor, a failed prospect, but in that moment, none of it mattered. My eyes darted to the monitors, the erratic lines, the rapid alarms. His heart was failing again. The surgeons were struggling with a complication in the stent placement. It was an issue I had studied extensively, something I had seen before. And though I had no right to speak, no authority, I did. I stepped forward and pointed out a method, a technique buried in a medical journal I had devoured during my sleepless nights after my exile. The lead surgeon hesitated. I saw it, the flicker of doubt, the awareness that I wasn't supposed to be there. But the situation was dire, and desperation made people listen. He followed my suggestion. A delicate adjustment. A maneuver so slight it seemed inconsequential. But it worked. The heart stabilized. The bleeding stopped. They were able to finish the procedure. I stepped back before anyone could question why I was there. No one stopped me as I left the operating room, my hands shaking, my breath uneven. It wasn't until I returned to the waiting area that I saw them, Amaryllis and my mother, standing there, having watched the whole thing through the observation window. There was no sound. Just the three of us in a space that had once been filled with the weight of their disapproval, now overtaken by something else entirely. When the surgeon came out an hour later and said my father would recover, something inside me loosened, but not entirely. Relief was a slow thing, creeping rather than rushing. I should have left then. I should have walked away. But my mother stood and crossed the room, something unreadable in her expression, something I had never seen before. She said she was wrong. Amaryllis, standing stiffly beside her, echoed it. She said she had misjudged me, that she had let their voices shape her view of me rather than seeing me for who I was. It should have felt like a victory. But all I felt was exhaustion. It had taken this, nearly losing my father, for them to finally see me. To understand. My mother reached for my hands. Hands they had deemed unfit for surgery, unsteady, incapable. Hands that had helped save my father's life. And for the first time, they saw what I had always known. I was a doctor. Not because they said so. Not because they finally acknowledged it. Because I always had been.